It's hard to get my head, at least, around how big this event was 50 years ago. What caused you to focus on these 3 days in particular?
Well, I think this was the biggest economic event in the post, in the post World War II era up until now, and yet it really didn't get a lot of publicity except for right around the time it happened. So I thought it would be a really interesting thing to look back on it and ask the question, how big was it? What were the implications then? And does it have some relevance for today? And I found it fascinating on all those accounts.
So, Jeffrey, one of the reasons perhaps it didn't get the attention some would like, part of it was economic policy, a lot of people's eyes glazed over. But beyond that, it was just a short time after the Nixon-China overture as well. I mean, Kissinger had just gone secretly to China for the first time, so there was an awful lot going on that summer. What happened during these 3 days in August of 1971?
Well, you're absolutely right. 50 years ago, there was the opening to China, there were the Pentagon Papers, and I think to the extent Nixon has been seen at all positively, it's been for his foreign policy achievements. But I think in the international economic realm, which of course has foreign policy implications, he also did something really dramatic. He and about 6 of his top advisors went to Camp David over a weekend in total secrecy. And they decided that the United States had to make a fundamental adjustment in its role in the world. And that related to the dollar, which up until then had been backed by gold. $35 equaled 1 ounce of gold. And if you held a dollar anywhere in the world, you could come to Fort Knox and basically say, give me the gold, which made it very easy for people around the world to hold the dollar. And yet on this particular weekend, the decision was made to sever that connection, to disconnect the dollar from gold. And on that Sunday night, August 15, 1971, Nixon announced to the world that the gold window was closed. Very dramatic and very, very fundamental for the decades afterwards until now.
And one of the things I took from your book was they didn't just decide to do this. Richard Nixon didn't decide it's just a good idea. They were driven to it to some extent. Maybe not something this dramatic. They could have tinkered on the edges. But we had about down to, I think, $10 billion worth of gold on hand. And there was like $40 billion held by central banks around the world. So there were a lot of pressures of various sorts being put on Richard Nixon and those advisors.
Yeah, actually, this is the story of the United States being all powerful at the end of World War II, and then the rise of Germany and Japan and the eclipse of U.S. unilateral dominance. So by 1971, as you said, the U.S. didn't have anywhere near enough gold to redeem dollars for gold. And other countries had gold, and in fact, there were so many dollars in circulation that the emperor had no clothes. And so rather than suffer the humiliation of having to say you can't have the gold when people came to the gold window, the US preempted it. But it's really much more than a story of gold. It's a story of the US adjusting to a different global economy in which other countries were beginning to rise, and the United States wanted them to share some of the burdens.
And that rise of other countries has certainly continued to today, maybe different countries. Now we have China, for example. Then it was Japan and perhaps West Germany, as it was then called. But it's certainly continuing today. What are the differences and the similarities between 1971 and 2021? I mean, we certainly have balance of payments, balance of trade deficits the way they did back in Richard Nixon's day.
Well, what happened in 1971 was the U.S. realized it couldn't hold up the world alone, and that it had to share power, and it also needed a lot of adjustments in the world economy. It ran in 1971 its first trade deficit since the late 1800s. Employment was beginning to be affected by imports. Inflation was starting up, we have a lot of those same factors today. Nationalism was rising, protectionism was rising. There was great dissatisfaction, as everyone knows, with the war in Vietnam. So, you look at today, we've got the same trade problems. We've got the beginnings of inflation. We have nationalism. And so, in both cases, in the 70s, the dollar, it was the first attack on the dollar. And I would say today, the dollar is more vulnerable than it has been in a long time, especially if you look at the beginnings of digital currencies and the rise of China. So there are a lot of parallels. The big difference, well, I'd say there are two really big differences. In 1971, Nixon was able to fashion a reasonable policy and effective policy because he had moderates in Congress on both the Republican and Democratic side. It was a Democrat. Nixon was a Republican, of course. He had a Democratic House, a Democratic-led Senate, but he was able to forge cooperation, something we're really not seeing very much of today. The other thing is the U.S., this was the last throes, I think, of U.S. unilateral power in the early 70s. And I think most of that is gone today. Today, we really have to find allies and we have to forge cooperation. There's very little that we can do on our own.
One of the things that Richard Nixon did back in '71 is shake up the world. As you point out toward the end of your book, there's a sense in which President Donald Trump did an equivalent thing, really shook up the world, really raised questions, didn't answer those questions quite the way Richard Nixon did. So if President Biden today wanted to take his top advisors up to Camp David, are there fundamental reforms that they should be thinking about that we might be surprised by that could really relieve some of the tensions we have today?
Well, I think, in the Camp David situation with Nixon, actually the Nixon administration had been secretly analyzing the global economy and all the changes that were taking place and all the pressures on the U.S. So when they finally went to Camp David, they had a plan and they had lots of contingencies. I think we're in a similar situation today in that the world economy really has to be refashioned in many ways. We are entering the digital age, and I say entering because some people think we're already there, but to me, this is like 1994 with the internet. We're at the very, very beginnings. And so thinking about a totally digitalized global economy, I think is really important. Yeah. The second thing is, we really have to think through how we're going to deal with China. We've never faced a country that poses such a broad-based economic threat. And so when it comes to our trade policy, when it comes to currency, when it comes to cyber, when it comes to climate, China has to figure in a very integral way. And I don't think it's going to work just to say, cut them out, decouple. That is not the nature of the global economy. That's not the nature of markets. So I think that the Biden administration faces some really major issues, but they have to, I'm hoping that there's some really significant planning in terms of the positions that they're going to take.